G'day, I'm Mark Hoth and welcome to Swift Almanac, where we teach you the basics of Swift in 10 minutes or less. Today's lesson is optional chaining. So let's have a look at optional chaining in 10 minutes or less. Optional chaining versus forced unwrapping. Optional chaining allows you to unwrap properties, methods and subscripts in a convenient way. By placing a question mark after the optional value, you will receive either the value or nil. This is the same as forced unwrapping. However, forced unwrapping results in a runtime error or crash if there is no value. So let's have an example. Let's form a class which we'll call person, and we'll have a variable called residence, which will be, they'll have an optional residence. We'll have another class called address, and we'll have a street, which is an optional string, and a building, which is an optional string. And we'll have a method function saying print street with the guard function, let the street equal self.street or return. So this is saying if street has no value, return and do nothing, and otherwise print the street. Then we have a function, a building identifier, which is the string which returns the building identifier. We'll also have another class called residence, and the number of rooms will equal to 1, and it'll also have variable address, which will be an optional address from the class above. Okay, so let's say we create John as a person, and then we create this room count, and we say John.residence, and we force unwrap that and find out the number of rooms from the residence, which we know should be 1. However, we haven't actually allocated the residence to the person. This is an optional value, and currently it's nil. So when we force unwrap it, that's going to cause a nasty error. So what we can do is we can optionally change this. To do so, I'll have to get rid of that error. So if we let the room count equal John.optionalResidence.number of rooms, then this is just going to come back as nil, and it's not going to crash like it does up here. This means that we can assign variables, particularly long names, with even multiple optional chains within them, and the compiler will test that all of them have a value and only return a value if all of them contain values. If one of them is nil, then this will just return nil. It won't crash as it will here. If, of course, we were to create a residence, then the first case is going to work. Now that the residence exists, it will be 1. Let's change this to be room count 2. So in both cases, when the residence exists, the code works successfully, but when residence or this optional value does not exist, i.e. it's nil, then this is graceful and this is a crash. So one way we could do that is we go if let room count equals this optional chain. It's going to say, it's going to come in here, John's residence has room count rooms. John's residence has 1 room, and if we get rid of this residence, then it's going to fail and be nil, and it's going to say unable to retrieve the number of rooms. Now, room count here is an optional int because the optional chain can fail and return nil. So let's have a look at a bit more of a complex example. If we just to write this address equals john.residence.address.street, the problem with this is we don't know whether the residence or the address is failing, so it's very bad for error handling or checking. It is a convenient way of going ahead and doing what you want it to do, but when it's not doing what you want it to do, i.e. there's an error, it's quite difficult to figure out whether or not it's the residence which is failing or the address is failing, and you need to do all of the error checking that you'd normally have to do, which this syntax is actually designed to avoid. Whenever you're assigning a value from an optional chain, it's always going to be returned as an optional. So this is going to be an optional address because this could fail. This is also the case when you're calling a method with a return type or even with no return type, i.e. void. That means you can have this as an optional void or an optional, whatever the return type is, optional string, etc. Here the method printStreet has an implied return value of void. However, due to the optional chaining, it returns a void or an optional void. It returns a void question mark or an optional void, so we can check if the method actually runs. So I'll just put these Johns back into play so that it's allocated. So if we look here, the address printStreet, now that's returning a void, it's got no return value. However, because of the optional chaining, it's going to return an optional return value. So here, if John optional chain address.printStreet doesn't equal nil. Now, normally you would expect that, well, printStreet is a void, it's not going to return anything, but it's returning an optional void, and so you can say it does not equal nil, it's all good. Otherwise, no addresses are allocated. So you can see that while the syntax for optional chaining is quite convenient, it also causes a number of problems if you're unaware of what could be going on. For instance, this return value from a void, and trying to determine whether in your debugging this residence or this address is the thing that's returning nil, so that you can sort things out and fix things up. One thing I would say is that this is an example of why you should use test-driven development, because in test-driven development you're running a test before you write the code, whereas in old school development, or when I learned to develop, you would write the code and then you would debug it. So debugging the code here is a lot more difficult, but if you're writing the test for the first one and then the test for the second one, then it'll be relatively easy to figure out where things are going wrong as part of the development cycle. So Swift and optional chaining and optionals in general do sort of presuppose that you're going to be using TDD or test-driven development, in my opinion. Well, that's it for optional chaining. If you have any questions about the tutorial, then please leave a comment below or hit me up on Twitter @SwiftAlmanac. Please subscribe to the channel, it's free, and check out our website at www.swiftalmanac.com. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.